right? So we're at a point now where they're clearly censoring anything that goes against the narrative. It's been happening for a long time. It's kicked into high gear. We have an obvious example of a place that did it right, or at least did it better than anybody else. And yet all they can do is attack them in every possible way because they cannot be wrong, right? You see media, government, these people don't ever come out and go, oops, our mistake. We made the wrong choice. That never, ever, ever happens. When's the last time you heard that? Never. They don't do it because they have an excuse. They have a justification. They come out and say, oh, well, here's why, and here's what we're going to do now. I mean, there's always some next part of it. It's never just simply our bad. That was completely the wrong thing to do. You will never hear them say that. So the media, instead of admitting that the deaths are continuing to go down and that Sweden never actually locked down and their economy is completely fine, everything's going well, that you can't say that because that shows you that they sided with the wrong narrative. Now, this is from Tony Heller's channel, doing an excellent job. No lie too big for the press in 2020. Here, I just want to give him a shout out because this is where I first saw it. Now, here is the article itself. The Swedish COVID-19 response is a disaster, they say. God, I mean, how embarrassing for Time Magazine. A disaster. Really? I mean, you could maybe argue some of the finer points, but a disaster. A disaster is what's happening in this country. The United States is a disaster. Half the country unemployed, right? I mean, people can't feed their families. The economy's completely collapsed at this point. I mean, I shouldn't say completely, but it's obviously a really bad way. Or your rights are being removed. They're creating a whole new society and reimagining it for you. I mean, this is a disaster, guys. I mean, I'd even take that back and say it's not a disaster. It's an orchestrated ruin. Disaster implies like it wasn't planned. It shouldn't be a model for the rest of the world, Time Magazine says. More specifically, Kelly Bjorklund and Andrew Ewing. Two people that you should never, ever listen to again. And you'll see why. Because they are openly lying to you in about every way possible. At the very least, being willfully deceptive and misrepresenting the reality. Now, it says, and this, I love how this is the way it starts. So this is their big thing. As a not they're saying we predict or this or that. It is a disaster and it shouldn't be the model. And it says, well, at this point we can predict. I love that it starts out that way. They're almost certain to result in a net failure. Oh, so it's not a net failure and suffering? Yeah, okay. But you predict that's what will happen. Cool, Time. I love that you're making a broad assumption and then just stating that as a matter of fact in your headline, because that's good journalism, right? Now it says a study published October 12th in the Journal of American Medical Association. And I believe, no, I have the other one up there. It says Sweden and the U.S. essentially make up a category of two. They are the only countries with high overall mortality rates that have failed to rapidly reduce those numbers as the pandemic has progressed. But you see, first of all, we're talking about overall mortality rates, and then we're talking about the fact that this is a country that is smaller, a country that has not shut down its economy, and a country that has allowed its people to continue about their free lives. That cannot be overstated. I would be willing to bet everything right now that most of the people that are truly suffering in the United States would have hands down taken the opportunity for a little more of a dangerous path forward to not have to be in this position, to not have to completely rely on the government for food for your family. I'm pretty sure they would prefer that. But of course, we have to remember that all of these numbers are based on faulty PCR tests and medical information that's been distorted, lied, profit motives for any number of different scenarios that, as a matter of fact, these numbers are at very least not accurate. To what degree, as usual, that's debatable. But we know, as a matter of fact, they're not accurate. Even the mainstream groups are now saying this. But they're not, of course, they're making it a very small reality instead of the very all-encompassing reality that it is. But of course, it's funny how they lump these two in and say essentially these two are the ones, and then go on to go after Sweden for the entire article and never make another comparison to how most of the things they're laying out about Sweden are far, far, far better than the United States as well as most other places. But we'll get to this graphic and things in a minute. It says, yet the architects of the Swedish plan are selling it as a success to the rest of the world. Why? Because it was a success. Because their economy is still open and people are still going about their lives and they are walking around and doing things that they want. Well, you're being forced to wear a mask, can't go to your job, don't have a job, and can't leave your home when they don't tell you can't, and are being violently arrested if you challenge any of these things, and your freedoms are being taken away in every possible way. But yeah, they failed, right? It says, and officials in other countries, including at the top levels of the United States government, are discussing the strategy as one to emulate. Just by the way, that's incredibly not true. I mean, there have been people that have talked about it, but to pretend that the U.S. in any way is discussing going that route, or that they're actually seemingly going that route, is just obviously not true. Are discussing the strategy, and that's my opinion, and discussing the strategy as one to emulate, despite the reality that doing so will almost certainly increase the rates of death and misery. Oh, okay, Time. I love how you just make that claim. By the way, don't expect them to follow that up with verifying claims of why that will almost certainly do so. You see, what they're doing is they're taking the safe, the comfortable, agreed upon realities that aren't actually verified, right? The fact that lockdowns work, the fact that masks will save your life, the fact that this thing is the biggest coronavirus death of all time, or that we're in the biggest pandemic we've ever seen in our lives, right? These things aren't true. None of them are. To varying degrees, there's falsities in all of that. But you're within the mainstream media, within the government circles, within all of this, it's safe to say so. You can come out and make the argument that lockdowns work, and if you argue that, you're a fake news conspiracy theorist, and you'll be cheered on by all of them. Doesn't matter about facts or evidence, because that's an agreed upon safe comment. So when they're saying that it'll almost certainly increase the rate, well, there's no evidence to back that up. And in fact, the evidence is countering exactly that. The literal evidence of Sweden is countering that as they make this argument. I mean, how stupid is that? It'll almost certainly increase the death and misery. Didn't this first time, but I'm sure it will the second time, though. Good job, Time. Countries that locked down early and or used extensive tests and tracing, including Denmark, Finland, Norway, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, and New Zealand, saved lives and limited damage to their economies. Not true, by the way. The actual stats show you that these lockdowns, in fact, did the opposite. I mean, the argument, because the point is that they took action. Right? And then when things went on to happen, they take any positive metric and say, well, that's because of the lockdown. That's not true. Or at the very least, it's not verified. I argue it's very clearly not true, based on every other example we have that showed the lockdowns actually increased the problem. And as well as the fact that now the World Health Organization is saying that we shouldn't be doing it, and so is most everybody else that started to be honest about it. But of course, you know the United States government, they'll never give up on their narrative. They'll just call everyone liars and start attacking people. But sure, certainly, right? Certainly. It says countries that lock down, and it says that they saved lives and limited damage to their economies. But what they're saying there is that because they chose to lock down early, that they didn't cause the damage to their economy that we're currently seeing. But this is to imply that the coronavirus would have caused the economic damage. I mean, the virus doesn't cause economic damage. It's the actions of the government because of that causes the damage. This is such an obvious misstep or sidestep. You can't argue that the lockdown limited damage to anything. The lockdown is what caused the damage. This is just painful. This is bad writing. But it goes on to say, despite this, Sweden's public health agency director, John Carlson, has claimed that the Swedish situation remains favorable. Yeah, because they're obviously better off than just about everybody else. And the country's response has been consistent and sustainable, he says, because it has been. They haven't seemingly faltered. The data, however, show that the case rate in Sweden, the case rate as elsewhere in Europe, is currently increasing. Oh, you mean the cases based on a upwards of 90% false positive test called the PCR test? Yeah. Let's scream about the cases, and then you can go on telling us why we're not listening. Sweden is in a bad way as you scream about the cases that don't amount to the deaths. I mean, we keep showing you this. How many times do I keep showing you the reality? Oh, here's the Sweden's cases. Here's Sweden's deaths. Do you think that Time Magazine doesn't see that? They just don't care. They have an agenda. They have a job. Someone's signing their checks. They know what they have to do. Very clear, by the way. Now it says average daily cases rose 173% nationwide from September to September 30th. Cases in Stockholm, that number increased 405% at the same time. Oh my God, it keeps going. But no deaths. All right, you see how they can do this. They can get all worked up about the numbers and 405% increase, 173 from this to October 30th, but it doesn't mean anything when there's no deaths. Right? I mean, it's just that stupid that they keep doing this, and people will act like we're crazy for not freaking out about the cases. Though some have argued that rising case numbers can be attributed to the increasing testing, right? You see how they just leave out also the false positive rate that they'll otherwise discuss as a false negative possibility for why it's way worse. Wildly dishonest. A recent study of Stockholm's wastewater published on October 5th by the Swedish Royal Institute of Technology argues otherwise. Which is interesting. They're seemingly to kind of noting on this idea, predicting COVID outbreaks in advance using the wastewater. It's not an accident. These things are being floated in different articles. Right? This is what they're building. They're building their medical pre-crime outfit underneath you right now, or at least in these locations they're talking about. And by year's end, should be there. Now it says, yet even with this rise in cases, the government is easing the few restrictions it had in place. So get this. So even as they even note that they might just be because of the testing with false positive tests, but even with these cases, they just go right back to the argument. Right? It's just breathlessly, but with all the cases, they're not even doing what they're supposed to, right? It's like, it's just so stupid. From early on, the Swedish government seemed to treat it as a foregone conclusion that many people would die. I mean, well, okay. So think about how ridiculous it is that they're trying to make it sound like they accepted people would die, then took actions that had a, pretty reasonable amount of deaths in comparison to a lot of other places. And that's bad because they allowed it to happen, but yet the U.S. government, who arguably was doing what they were supposed to, or at least, however you want to play that two-party illusion part in there, but lockdown, masks, border stuff, and has way, way more deaths, even per capita, understand. So how can you make an argument that it's a foregone conclusion because they're smart enough to see what was coming? They're smart enough to understand that what they did was the right thing to do. And by doing what the U.S. did and many other governments did, they only made the problem worse, which is very, very clear. But you see, from this point forward, they don't even reference anybody else. They just go on to make these really broad, specific points that when compared to everybody else, continue to show Sweden made it right. It says emails obtained suggest that the goal was all along, in fact, to develop herd immunity. Oh no, you got him, Time Magazine. Good, what a journalistic endeavor. You got him, right? Like this is the stupidest part about this is they're trying to make it seem like herd immunity, which I lost that spot. Where were we? Oh, it doesn't matter. But the idea that herd immunity was some kind of fringe idea. Oh, it was at the bottom of this, actually. You guys know what I'm talking about. But he said that the PhD in the other article we talked about that, no, it's not a fringe idea. It didn't just start in March 2020. It's been around forever. And Sweden was honest enough to say that's what we were doing. It either suggests that Sweden was the only country seemingly that was not going along with the game plan, or that there's something more going on here that Sweden's just playing their part of this deception. Who ultimately knows? But to say that they secret emails obtained that show that they were doing exactly what they openly stated they were doing? Bombshell. What? That's just bad writing. But here they have this whole thing over here. It's actually in this COVID fact check. They created their own website. Apparently. Time Magazine says, here's all the documents so you can see for yourself. That they are caught doing what they were openly saying they were doing. It's amazing to me. It says, for the sake of transparency, we created that website and we're posted some of the documents. It's really a joke. It's meant to make it seem like they've got some big thing. None of this is any bombshell. None of this has been secret. Everything they've been doing has been right on its face. It says the retired doctor recommended allowing healthy people to be infected in controlled settings as a way to fight the epidemic. Do you know what that's exactly like? Vaccines. It says one point would be to keep schools open to reach herd immunity faster. Of course, you see, this is where they're trying to get you disconnected from the real world examples of what this is based on. Right? They want you to think that only vaccines work. Don't question it. Don't even understand the science. Just listen to the doctors because vaccines you have to have. Only way to reach the thing that naturally happened before we ever invented this, but don't talk about that. What he's talking about is they're writing this as if it's breathless. Like, oh my God, we can't believe this retired doctor would recommend them to be infected. Like this is what these documents go over. Like they're leaked emails that show they were saying this. It's nothing new. The idea that vaccines create a reaction to create antibodies in your body. That's what they're supposed to do, or so we're told. So the idea of getting people infected in a mildly infected in a controlled setting is literally how the concept of vaccine started. They would literally take a little bit of the virus and just poke it in your arm and a little cut, and hopefully you would just get a mild version of it and you would pass it and then you'd have antibodies, right? It's so incredible to watch these people scream about science while they're hoping that you're just too stupid to actually know history and the science. They don't want you to trust the science. They want you to trust what they tell you is the science. What they're discussing here is basic. It says the country never closed daycare schools for children under the age of 16, and school attendance is mandatory under Swedish law, with no option for distance learning or homeschooling, even for family members in high-risk groups. You mean the children have a 0% chance of getting this and dying? Oh yeah, what a monster. It says policymakers essentially decided to use children and schools as participants in an experiment to see if herd immunity to a deadly disease could be reached. Well, no, that's their opinion based on the action to not restrict the lives of children. But sure, let's trust the Time magazine that's already made a bunch of grasping, leaping assumptions based on nothing but their opinion and safe, comfortable talking points. What they did was not restrict the movement and lives of children that weren't at risk of a disease that's arguably not very deadly, based on the information directly from the CDC and the World Health Organization, which we're going to show you in a minute. But they'll probably censor us for saying that anyway. It says policymakers essentially decided to use children in schools and participants in an experiment. No, they let them go about their lives, and it made you mad, so you call it an experiment. Multiple outbreaks at schools occurred in both the spring and autumn. How many died, by the way? Oh, that's right. None. It says at this point, whether herd immunity was the goal or a byproduct of the Swedish plan is semantics, because it simply hasn't worked. Well, according to them. See, not working means they didn't reach an arbitrary number of of immunity. Which, by the way, I don't even know if you could actually accurately find that to be something. But at the end of the day, their lives are still intact. Their jobs are still there. Their businesses aren't closed. They're allowed to go to the movies, go to the store, go to the beach, go to the park. They can do what they want. But sure, what a disaster. After all, it says herd immunity to infectious disease has never been achieved without a vaccine. Are you kidding me? This is the Time magazine. Once again, don't forget, we're talking about, just make sure you get these people in your mind. Kelly Bjorklund and Andrew Ewing are liars. I mean, flat out liars. I mean, that's a straight up deception. The idea that we've never, so what about the plagues and things that came around long before we ever had vaccine technology? You mean that did they all die? Did humanity just get completely wiped off and we were reborn again? Obviously, no, it worked its way through a large portion of the population and then it never came back again because those people had antibodies. But sure, listen to Time magazine because I'm a crazy idiot. Doesn't know what he's talking about. Right? I mean, this is how they're framing. And look, and you could even argue that about me, but understand that there are plenty of people that are expert medical professionals who are falling out of their chair when something like this is written. It's just unbelievable we can be in this position. And all they can do is bank on your desire, they hope is your desire to just blindly follow what you're told because of fear. Now, it says his government and the public health agency all say that the high COVID-19 death rate in Sweden can be attributed to the fact that a large portion of these deaths occurred in nursing homes. Of course, Time, at the very least, I'm actually surprised that Time even included that. But of course, they don't give you any more. They give you a very small paragraph and they jump right to the next argument and pretend that didn't get said. The reality that the obvious example that elderly homes, nursing homes, in every situation, predominantly in the United States, where upwards of some states had like 80% of their deaths in nursing homes, was an obvious problem other places. But they want you to read this and think, oh, Sweden, bad guy. They didn't do what they didn't take care of the elderly. Let's not talk about numerous examples elsewhere that are far, far worse than what we're seeing here. Let's just pretend like this makes Sweden a disaster. That's what they want. That's what they want you to think when you walk away from this. It says, in one case which seems representative of how seniors were treated. Again, remember what happened in New York. Despicable. Remember, thinking of this now, since we're talking about these care homes, this was actually, I had something at the end here. I'm jumping all over the place today, but why not? Why not? This is a really sad example. We're talking about nursing homes, right? As they're trying to disparage Sweden for what they're doing. Here's the UK. As I said, it breaks my heart. Let's do it first.
This is my dad, and what I'm doing is illegal. I am holding his hand. This is my dad, and what I'm doing is illegal. I am holding his hand through the window. And this is all I can do to see him, which is pretty bloody sad. Because he's got dementia, I can't even talk to him. Now, the nurses here are lovely, and everybody is really nice, but the bloody rules don't make any sense, so I have to stick my arm in a window. That's all I can do, see him through a freaking window. This is inhumane, and it doesn't make any sense anymore.
So her dad's got dementia, and all she can do is hold his hand through the window. It just makes me sick. I gotta stop saying that, because it just, it implies there's a metric of control over my body. It does makes me physically sick, but it's sickening. That this is the world we live in. Can we please stop mindlessly following and enforcing and just think about the reality of where we are? It's incredible. But they're pretending that Sweden's scenario with nursing homes and the way they treated the elderly was so terrible. And you know what? I'm not even arguing that maybe it was. But at this point, it's almost impossible to see it as that bad when we can see what happened here. We can see what happened in our country, and they pretend like, do you realize that nobody outside of independent media, nobody, I feel like I'm remembering somebody, but so few people actually talked about this discussion, like really dove into it and said, this is basically murder. These people, this is, at the very least, it's obvious malfeasance. They chose to just not care about these people. And some of the most vulnerable among us. Upwards of 80% in some of these places were only in nursing homes. And it says in this case represents the seniors that were treated in Sweden. This individual was not seen by a doctor the day before he died from COVID at a care home in Stockholm. The nurse told the daughter that her father was given a shot of morphine before he passed away, that no oxygen was administered, and staff did not call an ambulance. No one was there, and he died alone, she says. Okay, so let's compare. So we have an example of people getting forced intubated, where they shove tubes down their throat, which we now know they don't need because it makes it more dangerous. And that's what that happened to pretty much all the elderly discussions that I've had. And they also just ignored them. They sent in a bunch of COVID positive people within their homes, and it basically was just a plague scenario inside their homes. But in this case, we're talking about people that weren't treated like that were in their areas, that were instead, because of the increase in other activities, were deemed less necessary to treat. Somebody who was already going to die, somebody who was already struggling, had numerous comorbidities. That at that time, when they have numerous other people that are struggling from, in the moment issues, so we're being told anyway. This is the triage system. I understand this is exactly how our system runs here. But the difference was they cared for this person. They were there. They gave them a morphine shot instead of forcing tubes down their throat, which is probably pretty damn painful. So instead, this person died. And I'm not arguing any of these situations are ideal. You're in a situation where you're dealing with things that are unexpected and so on. But in this case, we have an elderly person who was actually treated and given something that made them pass quietly and painlessly. Whereas on the other hand, we have just untold amounts of elderly people that were forced intubated and killed in a very painful fashion. Others that were just left to die in a place where they didn't have anybody. Their family wasn't even allowed to see them. But sure, let's hate on Sweden because we got it wrong, right? Let's hate them because they did what we should have done. In order to be admitted for hospital care, patients needed to have breathing problems, and even then, many were reportedly denied care. Because that didn't happen anywhere else in the world, right? Regional healthcare managers in each of Sweden's 21 regions who are responsible for care at hospitals, as well as implementing public health agency guidelines, have claimed that no patients were denied care during the pandemic. Oh, I see. So they're saying it didn't happen, and Time is just saying it did, though, because we said so. Do you love that? It's just like this. So you're not even sure that actually happened. And yet here you are just jamming it in because, and by the way, it's far less severe than what we saw in the United States. It says, but internal local government documents from April and some of Sweden's regions, including those covering the biggest cities of Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö, also showed directives for how some patients, including those receiving home care, those living at nursing homes and assisted living facilities, and those with special needs could not receive oxygen or hospitalization in some situations. Do you love how they tried to make it sound like they were going to come around with some big point and be like, well, they said this, but we found documents that said nothing that was relevant. Right? Or just, the big lack of a bombshell at the end of this thing they built up to sound like they were going to sell you the point for why Sweden lied. Well, no. They said, well, we're not going to give you oxygen, probably because they knew that it would kill them. Well, let's make that out to be a bad thing. And at the end of the day, the life continued on. People had their jobs. People can feed their families. The economy wasn't closed. But yeah, what a disaster over there. These guidelines led to many people with healthcare needs unrelated to COVID-19 not getting care they needed, which happened in literally every situation on the planet that was dealing with the same thing. And in fact, happened dramatically more severe in this country. But sure, Sweden sucks, right? With some even dying as a result of collateral damage of Sweden's COVID-19 strategy. Some meaning that we're not going to tell you how much because we straight up killed a lot of people with exactly what we did. And it's not even close to the minimal numbers we could try to pretend happened. I mean, the reason there's nothing there is because this is probably stuff being challenged by Sweden. At the end of the day, you're arguing that people died because of COVID-19. Well, isn't that literally what everyone else is saying? It's staggering that this is mainstream media to me. And of time, one of these, long-standing entities. It says Sweden did try some things to protect citizens from the pandemic. Oh, I love that. Whoa, they did try some things, right? Like what they did was nothing. And they try a few things though. And that when they mean try things, it means they finally came around to doing some of the things that we are forcing on everybody. It says the government restricted public gatherings to 500 people. And the next day, the Public Health Agency issued a press release telling people with possible COVID symptoms to stay home on March 17th. And understand that these were all things that were not, I've spoken to numerous people there. The idea is that these were mostly recommendations, if not entirely, that people were not forced to do anything, as far as I could tell. It says, starting on April 1st, the government restricted visits to retirement homes, which reopened to visitors on October 1st without mask recommendations for visitors or staff. All right, they could if they wanted to. They didn't force them to, is the point. And that is the part that they don't like. They don't like that they didn't force people to do it. It says government restricted visits. It says later than in other Nordic countries. Oh, okay. So these recommendations, they say even when they did recommend masks and whatever else, they came later than everybody else. Oh, they're so behind the curve. Except the other countries were forcing people to do it. And you see, they just leave that out. Meanwhile, Sweden built neither the testing nor the contact tracing capacity that other wealthy European countries did. Now, we're just supposed to pretend that's a bad thing. Right? Like they didn't use their wildly invasive contact tracing surveillance method like everybody else did. What an undemocratic country. Right? Like how stupid this is. The entire argument, this entire article rests on the argument that what everybody else did, championed by the US government, was inherently the good, honorable, righteous thing to do. That's not true. But you see, when you pump in wrong information to begin with, you get the wrong answers, and they know that. The reason they didn't want to do any of these things to begin with is because they didn't have a plan to do all the restrictive and invasive things that everybody else was doing. They didn't need to do these things, and it worked for them. Because maybe you could argue they got a higher death more per capita, but you could argue there's any number of reasons why that is. And that on top, and by the way, that is even less for dramatic than we're going to show you in a minute than pretty much everybody else we're talking about here. On top as the fact that their life continued on, that they didn't lose their jobs and everything that they ever cared about. Here is Sweden right now.
So we are going to start on one of the main streets in Gothenburg. It's called Kungsportsavenyn.
And
right now I'm just walking towards the city center.
This one is the in July, I believe, or June.
You can see people here.
But there's videos of this of yesterday.
Enjoying the summer sun. And I should note that this is on a Friday after work, so people are enjoying themselves.
Do you remember when your life was still like this? Right? Do you remember when you were allowed to go sit out in the sun and not wear, and just do what you, look, this is in the world. This is in the world right now where you're told COVID-19 is tearing everything apart. How does that possibly make sense? Right? Look, even the argument that that they have a higher mortality rate. If this is what they're telling us it is, Wouldn't that then immediately translate to just everybody getting sick and everybody keeling over and nothing happening? Well, obviously that's not happening. So even with an increased mortality rate, that has to then immediately mean that that mortality rate is not even really associated with what we're looking at. This is based on what they're telling us. Look, people in there, in the restaurants, sitting down. The guys, life is normal in Sweden. And there's no way that you can argue this is a disaster other than trying to nitpick around small points that try to misrepresent the reality. Period. Look, people in the gyms. I mean, this guy did this for a reason, obviously, but this is Sweden, guys. They laugh at you. They're laughing at how ridiculous everybody is being. Here, hold on. Let's see what that says.
Come to the next stop. This is Systembolaget. And this sign says, you can wait a little longer today. Because of coronavirus, we are limiting the amount of customers in the store. So So in this case, we have a store individually choosing on their own accord to limit how many people can go in there, right? Now that is absolutely up to the store, right? The idea of how your capacity is very different than forcing somebody to wear an object on their face. And of course, that will very clearly limit their profit, but that's up to them, right? You can open a store and let one person at a time if you want. But the end of the day is you cannot force these things on people. But their life is continuing on. It always has been because they never took it away from them, guys. They took it away from you. And they tried, and this right now, this is time screaming at you to not think that this is okay. They want you to see this and go, horror, the horror. Look at how Sweden dares to challenge the world and they're probably all going to die tomorrow, right? Has to be, right? Because it's the biggest thing in the world and we're all going to die, right? Because they keep telling us that. Cases, 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 right? What's happening here? How does it make sense? Now it says family members of those who tested positive must attend school in person, unlike many other countries where if one person in the household tests positive, the entire family quarantines usually 14 days. Again, these are all just redundant points. It's because they are not afraid of it because one, according to the experts we're going to show next and many others, it's about as dangerous as the flu. And that they deal with that all the time, and that the herd immunity is now, all the things we've already talked about. So to continue just to dig into the same points because they're different than what other countries have done, and notably countries that are in a really bad way right now, what kind of ignorant person does it take to make an argument that that's better? I can tell you who. I can tell you these two right here. And Time Magazine. It takes those kind of ignorant people. It's just staggering. And it's actually sickening because you realize that what they're doing is putting more people at risk by pushing these lies. It says on October 1st, the Public Health Authority issued a non-binding rules of conduct that opened the possibility for doctors to be able to recommend that certain individuals stay home for 7 days if a household member tests positive for COVID-19. So arguably, you could see here that Sweden still believes this is something. But they clearly do not think it's what we're being told it is. They're just simply laying this down. So if they have severe cases, they can say, well, you're obviously very sick and you have an individual should stay home. And even that I take issue with, to be very clear. Governments, as you guys should know well by now. It says, but there are major holes in the rules, they say. They do not apply to children. Of course, because children are at zero risk, but they just, Time Magazine and all of the mainstream just can't get that through their heads. They just keep screaming about, oh, can't somebody think of the children? And it's 0%. It says all ages, people in the household who previously have a positive PCR or antibody test. But it says Sweden's government officials stuck to their party line. Don't you love that? Not that they know that they're right and they listen to the science and they listen to the people in their country who want freedom. No. They just stuck to their party line because it's politics. No. See, Time, that's you and your politics-ridden brain that can't get outside of that, who can't see it as anything else. Or that's what you want us to think. In any case, that's not what they're doing. They laid it out for you and said, here's the science, here's the facts, and we're not going to go against that regardless of how you attack us. Oh, politics. It says, Public Health Agency said at a press conference on July 14th that we see around the world that masks are used in a way so that you rather increase the spread of infection. Right? Here you go. This is the Public Health Agency in Sweden telling you that your mask, in fact, increases the spread of infection. That's what they're saying. That's their opinion. If you can't speak on what a public health agency has to say about this, then you know where we are right now. YouTube is going to censor this video. Even though everything I'm stating you can see is sourced, most of these from exactly the sources they otherwise point to. It says more exposed without face masks at a time when the rest of the world is clearly endorsing widespread mask wearing. Okay, so because everyone else does it, it must be right. Clearly, that's never the case, guys. History is so rife with examples of just because the masses do it doesn't make it the right thing to do. But sure, let's go with mass adoption. Let's go with mob rule, Time Magazine. That sounds smart. It says on August 13th, Technol said that to recommend masks to the public, quite a lot of resources are required. There is quite a lot of money that would be spent if you are going to have masks. Indeed, and this is where they try to argue that they didn't do it because money. It says, indeed, emails between Tegnell and colleagues at the Public Health Agency and Andreas Johansson in the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs show that the policy concerns of the health authority were influenced by financial interests, including the commercial concerns of Sweden's airports. Right, because none of these other countries even considered finances at all, right? Gosh, it's so inherently dishonest to pretend like the normal concerns of any government, when applied through a lens that you want them to be bad, is just a bad, evil, bad thing. How dare they put they're saying very clearly that the science is there and they're pointing to the science. And now they're just saying, oh, well, they're just lying because they don't want to spend the money. This is just an intellectually dishonest argument. But so is everything they're saying. It says Swedavia, the owner of the country's largest airport, says, quote, our union representatives fought for us to have masks at work, the employee said. But the airport's response was that we were an authority that would not spread fear, but we would show that the virus was not so dangerous. Oh, I see. So Time decided to take a single person's word over the entity and the entire Public Health Agency of Sweden. That's good journalism too, right? So this one guy stands up and says that we wanted masks, they wouldn't give it to us. And they just said, well, we didn't. How much you want to bet? I'm not going to even theorize. The point is that this is such bad writing. And that if we did this and took one person's word who just spoke on the record versus the literal government agencies, they would have a field day with us. They would say, look at these silly non-journalists in pen. Look at them. They don't even know how to you got to trust the government sources, right? I mean, it's just so dumb that they do exactly what they say we're not supposed to do. In any case, the point is that they've made it very clear it's about the science. And sure, maybe they're lying. Maybe finances had a bigger role to play in it. That doesn't change the fact that the science is not there. And I can attest to that myself. It says Swedavia's reply was that they had introduced the infection control measures recommended by the authorities. On July 1st, the company changed its policy, recommending masks for everyone who comes to it, recommending, right? So they're saying you can wear one. What monsters? So basically, Time is upset that they're not forcing people to wear masks that crack their teeth and give them bad breath and cause rashes and create pneumonia infections and do everything else we're talking about, according to the NIH. But sure, what bad disaster country Sweden is because they're not forcing you to do things that are completely questionable. Public Health Agency Director Joanne Carlson and General Counsel BitBacker wrote to the Ministry of Health and Social Affairs, cautioning the government about costs associated with classifying COVID-19 as a socially dangerous disease. And here comes the reality. They say, quote, after a decision on quarantine, costs for it, compensation which according to the act must be paid to those who, due to the quarantine decision, must refrain from gainful employment. So the reality comes out after they bleat about their opinion, which is the fact that they said that there are costs that come along with quarantines, which we are living right now. So you could argue that maybe they meant financial costs, or maybe they just meant the obvious societal costs that come along with forcing these quarantines. But then they also go into specific compensation according to an act. Why? Because Sweden has in their laws that they have to pay you if they force you to quarantine. What a monster, right? Because that's what we don't have in this country, and my family still hasn't gotten their stimulus check. Lovely. But because they're concerned with having to pay out every single citizen that's on quarantine, which would be astronomical, that makes them bad people, according to Time Magazine. And then they also cite the science, but who cares about the science? It says the uncertainty factors are many, even when calculating these costs. Society can also suffer a loss of production due to being quarantined, prevented from performing gainful employment, which they would otherwise have performed. That's more of the quote. They're literally saying exactly what every American is right now screaming about. That what they did has untold costs. They destroyed your business. You have no gainful employment. You can't, all the things they listed off. They destroyed your life. And they're still not even paying you for it. But you see, Sweden knew that they would have to pay for it. Sweden never implemented quarantine in the society. And guess what? Their life is continuing. They won. They succeeded. They did the right thing. And they just can't handle it. It also goes on to say, not only did these lack of measures likely result in more infection disease, don't you love that? They can't even say with certainty that the lack of measures did anything. This is Time Magazine writing an entire article about how they failed and it's a disaster. And this is their final. They say, well, they likely caused more death. How is this even journalism? How are these people even allowed to write? Sweden has fared worse economically than other Nordic countries. That's what they have to say. Okay, well, this is the real final point. Their argument after all these other things is that, well, metrically and per capita, and well, okay, it comes down to the fact that their economy is struggling anyway. So it didn't even really save them, even though that's fundamentally not true. And by the way, as we remember, they were talking about the lockdowns. I forgot I had that point up there, where they're saying that they didn't even do this until what was it, July 1st or that wasn't the one there. Anyway, the point was that if you look at the times these things happened, the very first time that the U.S. government decided their 15 days, which is turned into 9 months, cool, or 8 or whatever it is, minus the beginning, that happened on March 16th. So if we're talking about Sweden doing this like a matter of weeks later, and pretending like that was catastrophic, it's intellectually dishonest. They are knowingly lying to you. But here's the point about the economy, is that ultimately, I gotta, hold on. Dang it. There we go. I just want to pull this window up so you can see it. Ultimately, it's an incognito. It's one of these blocked windows, so I have to bring it up somewhere else. But Sweden's GDP slumped 8.6% in quarter two, more sharply than its neighbors, despite its no lockdown policy. Right? This is just more dog piling, right? Jumping on the pile, trying to Sweden failed. They're a disaster. Nothing they did right. But here's the problem. Why this is just completely dishonest is because, how's it going to come back from this one now? At the end of the day, there's a lot more going on than gross domestic product. Right? There's just only one metric in a lot of metrics that are used to decide whether someone's economy is actually doing okay. As it says here, a barometer of economic growth. Growth is a measure called gross domestic product. So we're talking about growth, right? So in the middle of what's going on, it's pretty obvious that most places probably aren't going to rapidly expand with increase in death and some people choosing to lock down of their own accord. You're going to have a pause or whatever. And what they're arguing is that they had a decrease. Dang it. I hate that these have to be on incognito windows. They're saying here they had a decrease. So that means they failed, right? They failed. There's no way they could succeed if they had a slump in their GDP. Well, the reality is they're yet again trying to deceive you based on a lot of things. The idea is there's a bunch more that goes into deciding whether or not somebody is actually having a problem. First, one of them is yield curve. The idea, not to get too deep into it, the reality is that Sweden's yield curve is looking pretty good. As it says here, one of the most closely watched indicators of an impending recession is the yield curve, even compared to the United States. Oh, I thought I had that one up. It's just, it's doing well is a point. So just because their GDP has not increased or it's actually slumped a little bit, as pretty much everybody's has, is not an indication their economy is collapsing like in this country. Well, let's keep going. There's more of them, right? We have things such as confidence indexes, which has to do with how people perceive how things are going. Well, in Sweden, the consumer confidence indicator in Sweden increased by 3.2 points from the previous month to 88.3. So they got better. Right? So they don't want to tell you that, right? People feel. So think about how important that is. The confidence index, the way that they perceive it went up. So even the people there believe that they're doing better, but don't listen to them. Don't listen to the government. Don't listen to Time Magazine. Here, and this for some reason, this one, when you click on the link, it brings you to the wrong page. Well, here's the actual numbers, and it's on the same website. Link is included. Consumer confidence in the United States averaged 86.56 points from 1952 until 2020, reaching an all-time high, which also went up. But then a record low of 51.7 in May. This is back. Anyway, the point was, arguably, these things are not bad in the sense. The biggest one to get to here is the point, is that Sweden's unemployment rate rose a little bit, 8.3% in September from 6%. Again, I think most places are going to see a little bit of these drops, but here is the staggering reality. Employment rate in the United States increased to 56.6% in September from 56.5%, right? So a huge portion of this country is not working. We know this already, though. But of course, it's only because of the pandemic, though, right? No, it's because of the actions of our government. But there's a lot more going on here that we could go through. Employment data. The point is, guys, to pretend like GDP by itself is just showing you that their country, their economy is collapsing is an aggressive misrepresentation. And they're doing so intentionally. Time Magazine, as well as everybody else that is desperate to get you to think that they failed over there, because it shows you the obvious plot hole in everything they're saying. Now it says, more exposed without face masks at a time when the rest of the world is clearly endorsing it. I already went over that. Oh, right here. So it says, our quarantine compensation, which according to the act, we went over this as well. Where were we? I think we were right here. So the Swedish way has yielded little but death and misery, they say. Oh, this is the economy right here. So remember what they're saying right here. Sweden has fared worse economically than other Nordic countries. But you see why that's a fallacy? Because faring economically is not something you compare necessarily to a local country or similar per capita. It's just simple economic benefit or economic prosperity. You can compare it with anybody going through a similar problem. So the United States, you can compare with Sweden. And you can clearly see that the United States is in a drastically worse economic situation. Of course, they'll blame it on COVID-19. But look at Sweden. Thriving. Living their lives. People walking around, enjoying their day, sitting at restaurants. You cannot call this a failure. A disaster. I mean, it is really ignorant to think that if it was continuing to expand like they're making it sound like it would be, if it was unchecked like this, that we wouldn't just see everybody infected. Like they want you to believe in this country right now, if we don't do everything all the time, that this will rip through the country and we're all going to get infected. Well, here it is. Here is an example of a country that has been doing this from the very beginning. And no, they had their spike and it very quickly went down to basically nothing. Pretty revealing. The Swedish way has yielded little but death and misery, they say. Right? Can you really believe that they had the nerve to say that after what we just showed you? Does that look like death and misery? I mean, how embarrassing for Time Magazine. That they are so dedicated to the lie that they're willing to come out and just state such obvious fallacies. Little but death and misery and, the continuing prosperity of their economy and your life and your business and your freedom. But yeah, death and misery, totally. And this situation has not been honestly portrayed to the Swedish people or to the rest of the world. Okay, Time, you want to tell these Swedish people? Feel free. Inform them that they're only living death and misery right now. Please, have at it. I wonder what they would have to say. It says, this is not the only case where Swedish officials have misrepresented data in an effort to make the situation seem more under control than it really is. Understand, guys, you can look up about 1,000 videos like this right now. Everybody there is more than happy to share the fact that they are living it up while you're locked down wearing a mask and don't have a job and can't feed your family. But sure, they're misrepresenting data to confuse the people that are living what you just saw. Sweden never went into an official lockdown, but an estimated 1.5 million have self-isolated, largely the elderly and those in risk groups. So there you go. The point is that they're adults and honest and individuals that can do their own thing. They can make decisions for themselves. And even within that, people self-isolated themselves. But you see, the other way, in these countries, they just acted like you were children, like you couldn't decide for yourself because fake news and conspiracy theory, and so they have to step in and tell you what to do for the rest of your life. It says recent data suggests that cases are yet again spiking in the country. Oh no, look at those cases spiking. It's everywhere. There's no indication the government policies will adapt, right? Because why would they adapt? What do you mean? Adapting implies that they need to change. Like they don't need to adapt. They are clearly on the right path. It says there is simply no way to justify the magnitude of lives lost, poorer health, and putting people at risk, putting risk groups into long-term isolation, especially not in an effort to reach an unachievable herd immunity. Countries need to take care before adopting the Swedish way. It could have tragic consequences for this pandemic or the next. Dun, dun, dun. Well done, Time. You are straight up propaganda. Unbelievable. But moving on, I just feel like I just want to let this play forever. Like, it just makes me so sad to see that we live in a world where people are too blind to see what's right in front of them. Not even a single person even wearing a mask. Do you realize what that shows you? There's no argument that can make this reality not what you're seeing right now. This wouldn't exist if what they're saying is true. Period. Moving on. I want to pause this actually so I don't lose the video. But here are some doctors in the Netherlands. Here's some other crazy, wild-eyed conspiracy theorists that don't believe in science, that are otherwise doctors with PhDs and doctorates that want to tell you that there's science that proves what they're saying. But yeah, anti-science like they want you to believe. Doctors in Netherlands state, we do not have a pandemic. And this will probably get this video censored, despite the fact that these are medical professionals who have a right to speak their opinion based on the science that they have researched. I believe I do have this video as well. Let's see.
Hello, I'm Elke de Klerk from the Netherlands, and I want to state that we do not have a medical pandemic or epidemic. We also state that COVID-19 should not be on list A for any longer, because we now know that it is a normal flu virus, and the normal flu virus isn't on list A. So we are also starting a lawsuit to the state of the Netherlands to bring this in with a large group of doctors and a really large group of nurses also, because we have contact with 87,000 nurses that do not want the vaccine that is being prepared for us. I want to state, if there is no pandemic, I am wondering why our kids are in schools with masks. There's absolute constitutional rights, and they cannot be infringed or infringed for any medical reason. There's no reason for panic. Also in the medical practice, there's no reason for panic. The panic is created by these false positive PCR tests. 89% until 94% of those PCR tests are false positive. They don't test for the COVID-19, and also the rest is false negative. So we have to look at clinics. We have to start looking at clinic. Medical doctors have to stop looking at those tests. That's very important. Let's go back to the clinics and to the facts. We have in the Netherlands now the regular press publishing the news that the PCR test is not a correct test. So I'm very happy about that. So there is hope. Thank you.
Statistics have come out that up until April 2020, there was 0 deaths in Ireland. These are the official statistics from the CSO, the Central Statistics Office. The first death was in April. And in the whole country in 2020, we have 98 deaths out of 5 million people. So in Ireland, 30,000 people die every year, 10,000 from cardiovascular disease, 10,000 from cancer. The 98 deaths in Ireland are preventable if they had been given prevention and treatment. And we see now that probably there will be thousands more deaths in Ireland just from cancer and cardiovascular disease.
Now, this was obviously just a clip, a compilation of a bunch of different things, of a bunch of different speakers, I should say. I'm blanking on the Irish woman's name right now. If somebody could share that in the chat for me. I don't know why that's off center. She's somebody that I recommend everybody pay attention to. I haven't had a chance to interview her myself, but I don't need to expound on what they're saying. These are medical professionals. Period. These people have a right to speak their opinion, who are experts in their field, who are speaking out about what's going on right now. And they are the ones being censored. This is the woman for the medical professional from Netherlands is telling us, look, even our mainstream media is now coming out and saying these tests shouldn't be used for this. And yet, from a worldwide scale, they are still being forced in. And YouTube is still censoring if you talk about things that go against what they're saying, despite the fact that entire countries are coming out and saying this right now. Do you know how ridiculous this is? Dolores Cahill, thank you. Do you remember how ridiculous this is going to get? And already is, if we get to a point to where entire medical professions and organizations and countries are standing up and saying, look, the science is not around mass, or the lockdowns don't work, like the World Health Organization is saying now. And yet YouTube will censor you for it anyway. And it will get to a point to where it's an absolute undeniable fact, and your video will still be censored. Think about how ridiculous that is and how disgusting that is. And they're doing this on purpose. And understand the worst part is that they know that they're doing that. They may convince themselves at some level that it's for some greater good, but I know at most these people understand, at most levels these people understand that they're doing something that's dishonest. At a core value, that they're doing this because they just don't agree with what that person's trying to say. And this is just bad. I mean, these people are telling you stuff that you should be listening to. At the very least, you should be allowed to consider. Not today. Not in this world. Because they're controlling everything you're listening to. Now think about while they have you in these lockdowns and while everything's being forced on you and you know everything that we just talked about. Think about that in reality to this next part that is not meant to be a discussion of how you should be treating yourself, other than just a general discussion of how you should always be taking these vitamins because they're good for you. But the idea that there's an interesting side effect of not being in the sun, and whether or not that's an actual that's a choice that seems to add to the litany of other choices that lead in the direction of making you more sick, or it's just a byproduct of incompetence and bad choices. At the end of the day, you not being in the sun is depriving you of vitamin D, specifically vitamin D3, which is what you really need. Has a untold effect on your immune system. So it's weird how all the things that are happening are converging in a perfect storm that creates you to get sick. An estimate of the economic burden and premature death due to vitamin D deficiency in Canada. 2010. The study's not related to COVID-19. It's just simply making the point that says the objective of the work was to estimate the economic burden and premature death rate in Canada attributable to low serum 25 hydroxyvitamin D, 25-OHD levels. Vitamin D deficiency has been linked to many diseases and conditions in addition to bone diseases, including many types of cancer, several bacterial and viral infections, autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular disease, you know, the thing that they're also pinning on COVID-19, and adverse pregnancy outcomes. The types of studies useful in this regard include randomized controlled trials, you know, like we're supposed to listen to. It is estimated that the death rate could fall by 37,000%. This is just, 37,000 deaths. This is 2010. This is long before. Representing 16% of annual deaths and the economic burden, $14.4 billion. Now, that's huge. 16% of the total deaths, $14 billion. This is just from people not having enough sun, or more specifically, not enough vitamin D. So then take that and say, what happens if nobody goes outside for 9 months, right? What happens if they stay in their room forever? Well, I'd imagine that gets worse. I'm not going to try to pretend I know what those numbers will be, but if this is happening just by normal default lack of vitamin D and sun, can you imagine what's happening right now? And then realize that if it says that it's estimated the death rate could fall by 37,000 deaths by giving people more vitamin D, can you imagine the dramatic increase in deaths in the same way if they don't have more sun and more vitamin D? So then you could argue that maybe the dramatic increase in deaths could be at least in part due to something like this. And that's not controversial. This is a basic reality of we should be taking vitamins that we're not. And the reality that that's something we're being deprived of with these lockdown measures. And this is what they just spoke on, right? This is what Dr. Scott Atlas just said, that the lockdowns are creating all these problems. People are getting sick. They're getting anxious. They're getting suicidal. They're getting everything. And then their teeth are cracking and their breath stinks. And there's rashes all around their faces. And yay, lockdowns, freedom, right? Based on numbers that aren't there. Vitamin D and multiple health outcomes. This is actually the same article. You can see that linked part right there at the bottom based on multiple observed. Wait, that was the one, right? Oh, that's strange. Oh, that's what I did. This is just another study. This was first, actually. Another study in 2010. Vitamin D and multiple health outcomes in the Harvard cohorts. Just wanted to show you that it's not the same thing. Not that this is new, but just so you know, based on multiple observed benefits of vitamin D, the article postulates that recommendations for vitamin D intake in the U.S. population for reduced incidence of multiple health outcomes. Meaning, take vitamin D, you'll be much healthier. And they can guess at how much death and so on. But it's a guarantee that a further and dramatic and on a dime lack of vitamin D will obviously increase the deaths and continued health problems. That's a fact. And that's where we are right now. And then this is the same study, as you can see by the bottom. I just want to show you some comments people had. And these are from, this is supposed to be in regard to, this is ResearchGate, so these are scientific comments from other scientists and cohorts and so on. It says vitamin D deficiency has been proposed as a link between cancer and lack of sun exposure. This hypothesis is supported by large prospective studies which show that vitamin D deficiency is associated with increased risk of several types of cancer. This one says over the past 15 years, more than 90,000 cohort studies about the correlation between vitamin D deficiency and cancer were published, showing you clearly that there is just this is increasing a lot right now. And we already showed you this one. No sun as well for the elderly person stuck inside, as well as people that aren't allowed to leave their homes. And then, of course, just to add on top of this before we switch topics here, the fact that on top of all of it, well, the UK is also telling you, oh, by the way, you can't have sex with people that are at risk. They're now controlling your sex lives too. It says coronavirus cases are surging, the cases, mind you, surging in Europe and the UK, where the deaths are remaining stagnant, which forced the government this week to They were forced to roll out, and they give you the illusion of doing it for your safety. They weren't forced. They're controlling your lives based on things that aren't there. To roll out new 3-tier lockdown system that banned casual sex with people from different households. So it's not just at-risk people. You just simply can't go out and have sex with somebody from another house. Gee, I wonder if this has anything to do with, slowing down reproduction. I don't know. The idea that they can eat, the presumption, the gall they have that they can step in and tell you what you can do in your sexual life is unbelievable to me.